So we're going to launch into our discussion of how STRIVE and the Sustainable Development Goals interrelate, leverage each other, empower each other. And some of this is a little bit of kind of history going back to the history of STRIVE and the history of the SDGs. And I think what we're looking at, as Doug mentioned, is a question of convergence. So STRIVE was established in 2011, and UKAID, DFID, was far thinking, I think, at that time. And I don't mean that just to flatter our funder, but which is never a bad idea. But I think that in thinking at that time, the investment case around the approaches to HIV prevention was very much moving, as Mitzi pointed out, towards biomedical interventions to treatment as prevention. And there was a fear that we were going to lose some of the great research evidence and momentum that we had gained over the previous 20 years in understanding the social determinants of HIV. And some of the work that we had all been doing for many decades around gender inequality, around violence, around poverty, issues that we knew were central to combating HIV, we felt were starting to disappear. This was a way to keep those issues on the table. And so we started on this 7-year-long journey to build the evidence base around how these structural determinants of health were powering the epidemic, and also how what solutions could be brought to bear on them. So we were going about all of that when, of course, was launched the effort to establish the Sustainable Development Goals, which were put into place in 2015. And at that point, we gained a lot of confidence because we saw that the world was also interested in systems level thinking. And we weren't, our fear of becoming invisible actually was misplaced because in fact, the world was turning a little bit more towards the perspectives that we were taking with STRIVE. So what we're talking about, when it's just a slightly different vocabulary, we talk about upstream drivers of HIV, we talk about structural interventions and approaches and drivers, and the Sustainable Development Goals also talks about systems level approaches and the interrelationships between society and the environment and the economy. So we're all on the same page basically, and we saw a great opportunity with what we're calling this meta-narrative, which maybe is a grand title for it, to bring these two threads together, because STRIVE is also it's coming to a conclusion, and so we're interested in how it can be leveraged moving forward, and I think the SDGs are one great way to do that. So our lens, of course, with STRIVE is HIV, and we think that the HIV lens is a wonderful way to have an entry point into making some of these cases around the potential impact and cost effectiveness of systems level thinking. And this goes back to, I think, what we've already been talking about this morning. Katherine Fritz did a wonderful job of teeing up as well, which is that treatment alone won't be enough. We knew that from the start, and now it's becoming extremely clear that at best, treatment can avert 60% of new infections, but as Katherine Fritz indicated, we're not turning off the tap on new infections, and that's what would be required. And just to reflect a little bit on the UNAIDS targets, 2020 is just literally around the corner, and we are not yet close to achieving the 2020 targets for the effort to reach the 90-90-90 campaign targets. So we see that, for example, there's still 13.4 million undiagnosed cases of HIV, 14.9 million untreated cases, and 15.3 million of people who are on ART who are not virally suppressed. So the SDGs, the 3 pillars, and great thanks to STRIVE has always had, in addition to its core partners, a wonderful set of affiliate partners, and UNDP has always been one of those affiliate partners. And we've learned a lot from our engagements with UNDP. And certainly around the 2030 agenda and the SDGs, there's a lot of synergy and these three pillars that the SDGs put forward: universality, integration, and no one left behind. And we're going to hear more about these as we talk more about the work that Strive has been doing and some of the trials and the results that we have to show you today. Achieving the SDGs is an ambitious and expensive undertaking, so we have to be smart. But the whole purpose of the SDGs, and I think one of the driving motivations around Strive as well, was to build solutions that would be more impactful at less cost. And part of figuring out how to be more impactful at less cost is figuring out where these, what we're calling development synergies, or these sweet spots are, where we can look for ways of investing upstream in order to catalyze multiple impacts downstream. So we were introduced to an article in Nature a couple of years ago by Doug, actually, that helped us to give us a framework for starting to diagnose where these investment opportunities were. And it's a way of thinking about interconnections between the goals and the targets, and to diagnose ways that they are either indivisible, reinforcing, or enabling. So if two targets or two goals are indivisible, if they're inextricably linked to the achievement of another goal, they reinforce each other if one aids the achievement of another goal, and they enable each other when one creates conditions that further another goal. So we like this framework quite a lot, and we decided to use it to start to map some of the connections that we were seeing amongst the issues that we work on. And so we went through several exercises of mapping these, and we'll just present a few of these today to help make the point conceptually of where to find these sweet spots. The two that we're presenting today are actually, we chose them because they relate to the actual studies and the intervention trials that we'll be presenting just now. So the first one we want to talk about is eliminating gender disparities in education, which appears under Goal 4 and is Target 5. And as you can see, eliminating gender disparities in education is related to 6 other goals, and we'll just talk a little bit about those interrelationships. So recent analysis of data from 186 countries from 1990 to 2013 show that each additional year of secondary education was associated with a 24.5% reduction in HIV prevalence among men and 43.1% amongst females. And this connection was particularly notable in South Asia, Latin America, and Sub-Saharan Africa. So we know there's a connection between girls' education and HIV prevention. And there are numerous pathways to this. One is exposure to sexual health education in schools. Another is the cognitive skills that one gains through education. And of course, education can also promote economic opportunities, the economic potential of girls, such that they gives them more decision-making power, and also they become less vulnerable to sexual coercion. So this has been fairly well established over the many years that HIV has been studied. But in addition, we know that girls' education would reduce child marriage by 64% in Sub-Saharan Africa and West Africa. And not just the impacts around girls' education are not just around child marriage, but also around sexual trafficking, for example. We also know that an extra year of secondary school for girls increases her future wages by 10 to 20%. So it's just one example of the way that girls' education is related to goal number 1, no poverty. And the color coding here is just meant to indicate that the dark green is an indivisible goal. So these are places where goals are mutually are so indivisible that it requires one to achieve the other. Reinforcing again is that one helps produce the other, and enabling is that they enable the achievement of the other. We know for zero hunger as well, women's education alone resulted in a 43% reduction in hunger from 1970 to 1995. And moving on to decent work and economic growth, each additional year of education for girls results in now 9 fewer births per 1,000. Economic growth can have many different pathways. Declining fertility can help in some ways, but also improving the pool of human capital through education is incredibly important for raising GDP. And climate action. This is something that climate action is a goal that is affected by many different targets and that we see in many different goals. So girls' educational attainment is actually associated with the National Index score of vulnerability to climate disasters. We know that girls and women are more affected by climate disasters, and we also know that they are essential to the solution to creating more resilience to climate disasters. And so this is just one example of how policymakers can begin to map the relationships between goals and targets, and in doing so help to encourage investments in these upstream causes of many, many downstream impacts. We also wanted to look at ending violence against women, since this is a topic that the Strive has been working on quite intensively over the past 7 years. And here we see 4 targets. There are actually 4 goals. There are actually many more goals that are affected by violence, but what we find is that there's not sufficient evidence yet to tie all of those together. There's a ton more research that needs to be done on the connections between violence and many other SDGs, and we're hoping that that more research can be done in these areas. But in terms of good health and well-being, that's where the most of the evidence shows connections, where women exposed to intimate partner violence are on average twice as likely to experience depression, 16% more likely to have low birth weight babies, and roughly 1.5 times more likely to acquire HIV, syphilis, chlamydia, or gonorrhea. That's according to WHO in 2013. We know that women who experience IPV, intimate partner violence, in their lifetimes is also associated with child stunting, and there's evidence coming from many countries. For example, in Bangladesh, women were more likely to have a stunted child if they had a lifetime experience of physical intimate partner violence. In terms of combating poverty, we know that women who are exposed to intimate partner violence are employed in higher numbers in casual and part-time work, and earnings are 60% lower compared to women who do not experience violence. Women have to take time off from work. Their economic productivity is certainly impacted by the experience of violence. And at a macro level, the cost of violence against women could amount to around 2% of global gross domestic product, and that's estimated at 1.5 trillion per year, or about the size of the entire Canadian economy. So we know that the cost of violence is extraordinarily high, and that women's economic capacity, because of their experiences of violence, is highly curtailed. So in terms of how to act on these multiplier investment opportunities, it requires a lot of innovation, both in governance, program planning, and resourcing across sectors. We're going to talk about that as well. We know that single sectoral payers seek to maximize 1 or 2 outcomes, and we know there's a flaw. There's basically a flaw in the way that cost effectiveness analysis is currently conducted, which misses these multiple co-benefits. And Strive has been working over the years to develop a co-financing argument to help combat or fill that gap in approaches. One of the examples that we have looked at, and we have a whole working group on co-finance, which is made up of economists and of health economists, is the example of cash transfers and HIV. And there's a trial in Malawi, for example, that we've done extensive analysis regarding. And it was a transfer scheme to keep girls in school in Malawi. It was $10 a month provided to in and out of school girls, and 30% of the money went directly to girls. It had multiple outcomes, including reducing school dropout rate, reduction in early marriages, reduction in HSV2 risk, reduction in teen pregnancies, and reduction in HIV risk. But when health economists did the analysis to see cost-benefit for HIV expenditures, the cost of an infection averted using this approach costs anywhere from $5,000 to $12,000. And that is deemed to be not cost-effective for HIV funding. So the question is, here's an incredibly powerful intervention that simply will not be funded. So yet, when we do an analysis of how much this would cost if this were co-funded by ministries of education in addition to health and other ministries, the actual cost of the intervention goes down, its cost effectiveness goes up. So we have several examples of these that are detailed in one of the briefs that Mitzi mentioned. So I do encourage you, if you are in that field and you'd like to learn more about the co-financing approach, to please do that or contact one of us. We're happy to talk more about it. We're working with the UNDP to put the co-financing model into effect in Tanzania, in South Africa, and in Ethiopia. So we hope to have more to report on this in the future. And then just a few final thoughts before I turn it over to my colleagues, is that the ultimate challenge for the SDGs is encouraging these co-financing with multiple benefits. But the challenge is not just technical, it's also political. And one of the things that we definitely have learned over our many, many years of collective experience in fighting the HIV epidemic is that problems are not just financial or technical, but political will and activist demands are absolutely key to ensuring that any action takes place. So we do want to just keep in mind the need for accountability that is required from activists and civil society to ensure that the SDGs are implemented in ways that achieve their ambitious goals. So I'd like to turn it over now to my colleagues from KHPT to talk about a couple of interventions that they have tried. As I said, one of the challenges is around financing. Another challenge is around the actual programming. So how do we program around these topics in effective ways? What lessons have we learned over the past 7 years in designing and implementing interventions around education and prevention of violence? And what kind of key thoughts can we leave you with as well as we move into the next phase of research and programming in structural drivers? So I think I'll turn it over to Ravi, actually, who's going to speak a little bit about the first intervention. Thanks.
Thank you, Katherine. Once again, good morning, everyone. And I'm Ravi. I'm from KHPT, and I have been involved in the intervention which has primarily focused on increasing girls' retention into secondary school and its completion. So I will be taking you through some of the learnings which we have got from our evaluation, and we'll try to see how these learnings can be viewed in terms of the sustainable development goal about which Katherine just now spoke to. So this trial, the Samata trial, was aimed to increase the secondary school completion and reducing the child marriage among adolescent girls from the marginalized community in the northern Karnataka, South India. And as Katherine said, that we have seen the benefits of keeping girls in school in terms of reducing the HIV risk in many ways. So the trial basically focused on making sure that the girls from the marginalized community, they enter into secondary school, they complete it, and thereby we propose that with these delay, with they being in the school, there will be delay in the there will be a delay in the marriage, and thereby the early sexual debut and the risk of HIV. So the trial was implemented in 2 rural districts of northern Karnataka, the Bagalkote and Vijapur districts, And these districts are primarily comprised of the large proportion of poor and the poor strata of population, as well as those belong to the scheduled caste and scheduled tribe, whom in India called as the marginalized population. The intervention covered the adolescent girls aged 13 to 14 years, and all the girls in these two districts and within the districts who were selected for the villages, the 80 villages which were selected for the intervention. So all the girls from those villages were included as for this trial. The trial aimed to improve the quality of life of adolescent girls by supporting entry into and retention into secondary school, and thereby delaying marriage and entry into sex work. If you see that how this trial fits into the arena of the SDG, so the Sustainable Development Goals, which talk about enhancing educational attainment, which is 4.1, eliminating harmful practices like child marriage, and reducing long-term risk of HIV by keeping girls in school. So the intervention was a kind of multi-level intervention where we intervened with the adolescent girls, their family members, as a primary recipient of the interventions. We also intervened with the boys who were also part of this whole community and had played a major role in the process of ensuring girls that they attain school, and also working with the schools and SDMC members. So the committee which makes sure that the facilities, the infrastructures and other things are maintained at the school, and the whole school environment is made conducive for the girls' education. For the purpose of evaluation, a cluster randomized control trial was used, and the trial was between 2014 to 17, and the evaluation was among the girls who were aged 15 to 16 at the end line, their families and the school. For this presentation, we are just focusing on the results which we got from the girls' analysis or the girls' data, and still we are in the process of analyzing the results from the school and the other interventions at the family level. So overall, the result didn't show any effect of the intervention on the primary and secondary outcomes. So the primary outcomes which were aimed to keep the girls in school and also to complete the secondary school. So our main outcome was the proportion of girls who complete secondary school. By completion, we meant that they appear in class 10th exam, because there are a lot of dropout happens before appearing into class 10th exam. So we found that the rates of appearance in the class 10th exam were almost similar in intervention and control arm. Similarly, the rates of marriage were almost same in the intervention and control arm. The other secondary, however, it is important to just note here that the rates of secondary school completion were much higher from the state average, if you see, and also the rates of marriage were lower than the average. So though it shows some positive inclination on that front, but if you compare across the intervention and control arm, we didn't find a difference. However, when we analyzed the data by the district, so one of the two districts, Vijaypura, had shown an increased secondary school entry and completion rates, and which contributed to the intervention. So the rates of appearance in the secondary school exams were relatively higher in Vijaypur districts in the intervention area, which is 76%, 77% compared to 72% in the control area. And one of the secondary outcomes which related to the entry into secondary school was relatively higher in the intervention area compared to the control area. So we got a kind of a mixed result in terms of the impact of the intervention. And what we learned is that to address the secondary school dropout and child marriage among girls, a multi-level intervention is needed, and it is feasible to implement even in the most marginalized community who are generally left behind. So if you see, one of the 3 pillars of the SDG is that no one is left behind. So we attempted this intervention, and we found that it is important to have a multi-level intervention to ensure that the girls' retention into secondary school, and even it is important and it is feasible to have such intervention in such a setting which covers or which talks about the most poor of the poorest of the poor population. We also observed a large secular changes in the secondary school completion and the marriage rates, potentially due to successful implementation of the government schemes over the past 2 decades. And this made us difficult to assess the value of the core intervention, because we had seen a kind of sweeping secular changes over the past 20 years, which has enabled the girls in general to do better in terms of their schooling. We also learned that though the similar structural forces affect the schooling and marriage, there are stronger cultural forces that are linked to marriage over education. So it is easy, or it is relatively easy to change the norms around the schooling, girls' schooling, but it is difficult to change it around the marriage. And also identifying the context-specific underlying norms that impact schooling and marriage outcomes are very crucial. So we hypothesized in the beginning that the norms around marriage or norms around schooling are quite linked, like a very linear relationship. For example, if you keep the girls in school, thereby there will be a delay in marriage and a delay in the sexual debut. But we didn't find so. And then what we found, that there are other underlying norms, like norms related to puberty, norms related to purity and the family honor, which has a more importance over the norms around the child marriage. So despite these improvements, still substantial proportion of girls from these marginalized communities remains at risk. When we say that remains at risk, means still 25% of the girls from these community are not completing the secondary education, and still 10% of the girls are getting married at the early age. And this call for the design and implementation of more focused and targeted intervention if we want to achieve the sustainable goal of proposed on that. So I have this much from the Samata trial, and I will request my colleague Ms. Parinita Bhattacharjee to speak about the other intervention which we had implemented in the similar setting, and which was focusing on reducing the intimate partner violence and increasing the condom use among the female sex workers who are in intimate partner relationship. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ravi. I'm going to talk about Samvedena Plus. This is a trial that we implemented with support from Strive and MRC. And it was implemented in the same district, one of the same districts called Bagalkot. The aim of the trial was to reduce violence and increase condom use within intimate partnerships of female sex workers. I was very excited when Katherine in the morning mentioned about female sex workers. Sometimes we don't do that. It was implemented in 2 talukas, sub-districts of Bagalkot district in northern Karnataka, south of India. And the population of focus was female sex workers, age 18 and above, with an intimate partner. I wanted to share that sex work in Bagalkot districts is largely home-based sex work. Average age of entry into sex work is 15 or 16 years, and most of the sex workers enter into sex work through a religious structure in a system. It's called Devdasi system. The sex work villages, the sex work communities, who are largely from marginalized communities, scheduled caste and scheduled tribe, are in the same villages where other communities live, but they are separated in terms of, if you see geographically, they will be behind the main village, but the communities interact. The clients largely come from the general community, and they come into the sex work spaces, sex work houses, to engage with the sex workers. In the intimate partners, largely our survey shows are married men They initiate these relationships as client and over a period of time become lovers, boyfriends, or intimacy increases and become intimate partners where they stop paying for every sex act, but there are other exchanges that happen in that relationship. Our intervention links with SDG 5.1 and 5.2, which aims at achieving gender equality by ending all forms of discrimination and eliminating all forms of violence against women and girls in public and private spheres. This was a multiple level interventions. We worked with sex workers, one-to-one in group reflection sessions. We also work with their intimate partners identified by the female sex workers, also in groups, but even as couples through counseling sessions, addressing condom use and violence. The intervention was implemented by a sex work-led community-based organizations. So a lot of effort and activities were done with the CBO in building their capacity to address intimate partner violence. Interestingly, we have worked in these communities for last 10 years, addressing HIV prevention, and did work on violence, but largely from non-partners, which is police and clients. And at the end of 10 years, the sex workers came together and said that intimate partner violence is something that they would like to address. So this need of this intervention was brought in by the sex workers themselves and was implemented by their CBO. Because it's rural-based sex work and they live in the same villages, some activities were also done in the larger community to talk about IPV, talk about violence against women in general, and develop champions who would talk about domestic violence and intimate partner violence in general. It was a 2-year intervention, and a cluster randomized controlled trial was done to evaluate the intervention at the end of 12 months and 24 months of program implementation. Several outcomes were measured. The primary outcomes were physical and sexual violence and consistent condom use, but there were also secondary outcomes at endline, which included acceptance of IPV, disclosure, knowledge of self-protection strategies, efficacy of condom use, and solidarity. We did not find any difference in the primary outcomes across arms, both control and intervention. However, there was lower acceptance of IPV, a higher level of self-protection strategies, and solidarity among female sex workers around IPV issue in intervention arm. Interestingly, at endline, the reporting of violence was very, very low, both in control and intervention. And because of this low reporting of violence at endline, it makes our primary outcomes results inconclusive. There were several learnings. One of the reasons of doing this intervention was that when we talk about IPV and talk about intimate partner violence interventions with women, we have found that it does not include female sex workers, even if they live in the same villages. And they're always left out. So one of the reasons of doing this intervention was also to advocate for violence against women's program to include women who sell sex to ensure that no one is left behind. This is also a first intervention globally which aimed to address IPV against female sex workers, and it does demonstrate that feasibility of delivering such programs is there. Intimate partnerships of female sex workers are complex, and there is qualitative work around it, and we know about it. And hence, we do realize that, or we learned that, a standard approach of doing intimate partner violence program with women may not work in the context of sex workers, and you have to adapt it, tweak it, with consultations with female sex workers. Despite all of these complexities, we see hope because we did find that changes in acceptance of IPV, awareness of self-protection strategies, and solidarity among female sex workers around IPV did improve. Thank you very much. Which I invite Saidi now.
Thank you, Parinita. I'm going to take you from southern India all the way to East Africa, to the beautiful city of Mwanza in Tanzania, where we did a very large cluster randomized trial, which is ongoing, but we have completed part of of the trial, with the aim of evaluation of interventions that aim to empower women, prevent intimate partner violence, and promote healthy intimate relationship. The study population is women who are enrolled by a local organization in a microfinance loan schemes, which is given in small groups of about 10, 20 women. And there are quite a range of possible synergy potential here: SDG Goal 5, Target 2, as well as Goal 3, Target 3 and 4. We conducted this study in Mwanza because, as in many settings in sub-Saharan Africa, we have very high rates of intimate partner violence. These results shown in this slide are from our baseline in this trial, where we found, on average, more than half of women having ever experienced different forms of violence, and between 17 and 39% having experienced this during the past 12 months. So it's obviously a huge problem which we need to address. Not only the prevalence was high, but also these experiences actually coexistent. So women reported more than one form of violence or abuse. It's only 27% of women who did not report any experience. So we are talking here of a huge problem, which is almost universally experienced by women in these settings. We were also looking at this baseline data, able to identify some of the factors which are associated with this, which also have been shown in other studies. You know, this was more common in young women, women with less education, as well as women having younger male partners. Violence was also associated with increased reporting of symptoms of poor mental health. So there are obviously a lot of health impacts on this, which justifies testing interventions as we did. We recruited 66 groups. Half of these were assigned to the intervention and another half to the control. The intervention was based on 10 sessions curriculum, which we developed, called Wanawake na Maisha, which is a Swahili word for women and life. The sessions were given every 2 weeks, so it took 20 weeks to complete. And they were participatory and reflective, encompassing a range of topics. And they were delivered by highly trained facilitators. So overall, just the conclusions at this point, based on the data we have so far seen at baseline and also during the implementation of the trial, very high prevalence of violence and abuse, which obviously provided a very strong justification to do this trial in northwestern Tanzania. The findings from this important trial, the findings we have received up to now, and what we are hoping to see in the future ongoing work, will help to determine if this intervention will help to reduce violence and abuse in settings like Tanzania. And the study that shows that it is feasible to implement an intervention package like this using some existing women's network, such as microfinance scheme. We have the studies, the findings are unfortunately embargoed until Thursday, so you are welcomed to this session at 2:30 on Thursday. But we are very excited to be here to present the findings from this main trial after a lot of work which we have done. But we also have other ongoing work, which is, we have an ongoing trial where we are looking at the impact of the same intervention, but in women who are not receiving microfinance loans. We are also exploring other things, looking at men and using innovative approaches to determine if there are similarities and differences between men and women towards violence. We are also interested to explore what are the drivers of violence perpetration, and we have a number of studies which we are doing looking at this from the perspective of men. And then in general, how can we engage men in prevention of this problem, which is a major issue in women in our settings. Thank you.